Thank you, everybody, for joining us on this 5-part series. Today is series 3. We appreciate your time and hope that you find this beneficial and informative. As we continue, we want to make sure that this is interactive as possible. So please post your questions both in Slido and in the chat area in Zoom. So either one would be sufficient. And if we get so many that we don't answer all of them today, we will definitely follow back up and make sure that we get you an answer. Today, there is no sales pitch. Our agenda is purely to share the essential knowledge, insight, and maybe bring a little fun to a dry topic, which I'm hoping our panelists can do. So they live and breathe this every day. Want to take a few moments to introduce our panelists today, and then we'll kick it off in our first area domain and get some questions going. First, we have Karen Walsh, certified CMMC ABRP, founder of this and CEO of Allegro Solutions. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you very much. We have
Angela Rittenbach, CISSP, and president and CEO of River Solutions Incorporated, and president of also cyberreach.org. Thank you for joining us, Angela. Amira Ahmad, I haven't seen her yet, but hopefully she'll be joining us shortly. And then we have Thad Wellen, consultant, IT security with Dell Federal and adjunct professor at McKinney-Dree University. Welcome, Thad.
Thank you.
We also have Eric Lunsford, independent consultant, cybersecurity around CMMC, NIST 171, NIST 53, FedRAMP, FISMA, SOC, ISO as his specialties. Thank you for joining us today, Eric.
Thank you.
And Kyle Lai, president and CISO and head of services of KLC Consulting. Welcome, Kyle. Also joining us today from Stealth, we have Dasha Deckworth, our president and founder of Stealth-ISS Group. Welcome, Dasha. Robert Davies, our CEO at Stealth-ISS Group. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank everyone for joining in. Appreciate it.
And Mike Pedrick, vice president of consulting. So appreciate you being with us as well. All right. Well, without further ado, let's get going, and I will share slides and talk about our topics for today and the domains we'll be covering. So give me one. All right. All right. Well, our series, this 5-part series, has been to cover the 17 domains within the CMMC model. And we're covering them in the focus of being certified for a level 3 certification. So today, we'll be covering 3 different areas: risk management, security assessment, and audit and accountability. So to kick it off, first, in risk management, wanted to ask a question about if IoT devices are within scope within the CMMC model. And I'll throw that first question out to Karen.
Oh, so I get the hardball question. We were talking about this a little bit yesterday. I think it depends on what information they're transmitting. We talked sort of about whether or not your toaster would be, and your toaster is probably not sending any information, but if someone's talking on a Google Home or an Alexa, I mean, I would just say that it's the same risk that you're running with any IoT security. If it's going to be touching data, CUI, then it would be in scope, but I'll pass that off to people who are probably a lot smarter than me.
Anybody else that want to jump in on that question?
Yeah, I think, yeah, so I think this is really, before you really start evaluating the risk, you probably want to identify the scope, understanding what kind of data, in our case, might be the CUI or FCI, the type of information that we're dealing with. Then based on the understanding of the scope of information, then we can identify what kind of threats, right? What kind of threats that might actually exist that impacting the data that we actually handle, and what kind of vulnerabilities that we actually have, right? Based on the threats that we have, because the vulnerabilities is really a place where the threats can actually expand and that become a real problem. So that's kind of what we really have to identify is what is your scope, the data, the threats, and probably the possibility, what is the frequency, what is the probability of things might be could occur, and also what is the impact on the confidentiality, integrity, and the availability.
Thank you, Kyle. I have a question here. If you don't have any non-vendor supported products, can the practice be not applicable?
So I'll take that one. I would say yes and no. I say yes as in the fact that you don't have to answer to the fact that how you manage those, but I would say no in the fact that you need to have a process to be able to deal with unsupported products, because just because you don't have anything today doesn't mean that next week you might have a device that's no longer managed or supported by a vendor, and you need to figure out processes on how to deal with that. Do you isolate them from the network? Do you make sure that only limited users have access? Do you only say it's a VM and you only turn it on when you absolutely need it, and then you make sure you turn it off when you do? So those are some of the things that I would say. It's kind of a yes and no answer. You need to have a process, but you currently might not have to actually answer to any of the assessment objectives.
Appreciate that, Thad. Some of the terminology within the controls within these domains seems to be kind of vague. And one of the questions they had was, it says periodically perform risk assessments to identify and prioritize risk. What does periodically mean? Once every 10 years, every 6 months? Is there a defined requirement of frequency, or it really is up to each organization to choose? Kyle, why don't you take that one?
Sure. I would say it really depends on the type of control. So how often you are going to change your password, for example, it might be every 90 days, right? And if you actually say I change every 2 years, it might be a little bit too long, right? So I think there are some kind of standard practices. If you don't really know, there are some kind of practice and kind of frequency that you can probably check. There are some other standards. I mean, right now in the CMMC and NIST 800-171, they don't really tell you exactly what is the periodic means. I think from the different standards out there, there's ISO, there's the CIS, some of the Microsoft recommendations. I think those are some of the things that we can refer to. So I would say it really depends on the type of the controls, but periodically, usually I would say suggest is less than 1 year.
I appreciate that, Kyle. Karen, please.
I was going to say at least annually.
Right.
I think if you're looking at any regulation or any standard that's underlying CMMC, they will all use at least annually, despite the fact you might not like it. Or if you're making a substantial change within your environment.
Amira, I have a follow-up question for you around this. So annually, I appreciate that, Karen, but what is best practice? We all know check the box minimum. But if you're doing it in your own network based on what you understand to be secure, how often would you do it? Amira?
Yeah, so annually is correct. There is a formal definition for periodically, which is something along the lines of as organizationally defined, but not less than once a year. And you can find so the CMMC appendices, which is generally considered out of date at this point. It's a document that's available right alongside the model, the assessment guide. The appendixes have a section for a glossary, and that section is actually one of the most relevant sections that you should be looking at, and that's where periodically is defined. In regards to a best practice for risk assessment, you know, an assessor is not going to ding you if you do it at least once a year, but you should have some sort of a policy or a procedure that says, here's the frequency required by our group. If you're a huge company, you should probably be doing it monthly. If you have a fairly simple company that doesn't change often, 6 months. It's really based on, you know, the amount of threats and changing landscape you're looking at.
Thanks, Amira. You know, under this first domain risk management, you know, we have identify and evaluate risk, manage risk, which is under level 3, but I threw in here in the slides, manage supply chain risk. That's under level 4, but wanted to throw it out there. Shouldn't that be something people are still considering in their security plans, even at a level 3? And to what degree? What would be best practice?
Yeah, so I think this comes down to the organization. So if you're building something and you are ordering parts from all over the world, this is something you should be looking at, so you make sure that you don't put counterfeit parts inside of whatever your widget you're building. So I think it all comes down to the industry that you're supporting. I will say I will not be surprised that when the final review and assessment procedures and the review of CMMC 2.0 is going to be released, that this gets moved down to a level 3. And I say that because of the executive order that Biden signed here a couple months ago, that this is one of the things that he was highlighting. And I think it's something that's very important. It's been going on for years. I have a few stories of my own where you bought some stuff from vendors and then they recalled it because it turns out there's parts in there that didn't belong. And lo and behold, this happened to be, I won't name the vendor, but it was a switch. And we popped up in 2 exact switches and we looked and we're like, why does this one have extra parts? Turns out that somehow supply chain got interrupted and that switch actually came from China when it was on the approved vendors list for DOD products. So this is something that we all need to be aware of. It comes down to the industry you support, and you should be managing risk whether or not the compliance standards are telling you to or not.
Great, appreciate that.
And I'd add to that I think as part of managing the vendor risk, I think to the extent that some of the changes we're seeing are going to be responsive to the executive order, you need to also consider as part of your supply chain any open source code that you're using and have a way to manage that when you're building things.
Well, and David, if I wanted to add too, I mean, all of these questions really organizationally defined, periodically, what's in scope, you know, what controls fall into which level. It really does depend on the size of the company, the business of the company. It all depends, right? The answer is it depends. And effectively, if you are documenting what you do and then demonstrating that you do what you said, then from a compliance perspective, that is inclusive. But there is not one size fits all or one, you know, response that fits every company. And so all of these questions about periodically or what's in scope, I mean, if you define those things up front, draw your boundary diagram, define what is in scope, what's out of scope. But then most importantly, regardless if you say 30 or 60 days, most importantly, do you do what you said you were going to do and follow that standard?
Appreciate that, Angela. Any last points under risk management? We're trying to keep this 15 minutes per domain before we jump on to security assessment.
But yeah, I had a quick point about this kind of, it depends. Yes, it absolutely does, but all of a sudden you're leaving the decision up to the assessor, and no two assessors are created equal. So by default, there could be ambiguity and differences in decisions. If one assessor thinks, well, if the company is 20 million in revenue and this needs to happen annually, and another person thinks, well, another assessor thinks it's 20 million revenue and it needs to happen every 6 months. Who's right? How do you figure that out? Or is it really just up to the assessor and a dialogue with the assessor?
Well,
Eric,
is it up to the
or
assessor,
Angela.
or is it up to the organization? I mean, within reason, right? The organization couldn't say every 10 years, right? So you're right. There is that different assessors could have different views, but the company, I would think, should be able to identify why they're selecting 60 days or 6 months or 12 months, right? There should be a reason why those time periods are defined.
Is this something CMMCAB would check on once they receive the assessment? Because there's an audit process, isn't there? Once the assessment is done, it goes off to the CMMCAB for checking.
So one of the differences between CMMC and federal information system standards that the government uses for their own systems is CMMC is not prescriptive. It's purposefully not prescriptive.
Right.
And that's the same as the NIST SP 800-171 that CMMC comes from, where they really want to give power to the organization to set the limits and schedules that are appropriate to the organization. Now, does that mean that organizations should pick the lowest possible threshold? Maybe, right? Because if for some reason your system can't do something, don't make your policy harder than what you can actually do, right? But like Karen Walsh says, she's on point. You should be able to justify your choices.
Right.
If you have to give an exception, have it in writing and say why you decided that this is a good thing to do. Your risk assessment or risk register should include, hey, I'm worried that my vendor is going to get compromised. What does that mean to me? What safeguards can I put into place? Right? Even if you don't have a formal supply chain risk policy and program, you might have a couple lines on your risk register about supply chain related threats.
And I actually think it was Angela who originally said that. I just sat here and listened to her. But I agree. In my audit experience, if you can explain your reasoning and you've done something reasonable, then you've met a threshold. But I also think if the underlying goal of CMMC is security, that starting from securing your stuff first and then going back and saying, did I do everything that it said, and making sure you've covered your bases. I always think in terms of putting things in place, getting secure, and then making sure that what you've done actually matches the boxes you need to check.
Thank you, Karen. For time's sake, to keep us on track, we're going to move into the next domain, security assessment. And anybody that still had questions on risk management, please don't hesitate to continue to send us those. And like I said, we will get you answers after this presentation. So next one is security assessment, covering development and manage a system security plan, define and manage controls, and perform code reviews. So one of the questions we had around this domain is, can you give me an example of how to perform continuous monitoring and security controls? So why don't we throw that one to Eric?
Yeah, so continuous monitoring has to be something that the company, agrees with, puts in place, has to be based on those processes, policies, and procedures that are developed for the best practices for those controls. Because as we know, each company requires different levels of maturity per their control, depending on what you guys pointed out, the size of that company. But I think it is very important to establish a continuous monitoring process and review those controls, as we've talked about annually. But also there's those other controls that we talked about when you do any kind of change configuration and management, where you have to do that risk assessment based on that change before you implement it. So basically that's what I feel is really important for establishing that continuous monitoring.
Thank you, Eric. Does anybody else have anything to contribute under that?
So I would say that for all the practices, you should have them defined as weekly, monthly, quarterly, semi-annual, annually. And then, of course, there's going to be quite a few controls that are in that annual bucket, but there's going to be a lot of controls that are either daily or weekly, like the audit family. Obviously, you're not going to audit once a year. You're going to either audit on a daily basis, depending on your environment, or maybe it's on a weekly basis, or maybe you actually have a SOC that's monitoring that 24/7. So I think all the practices should be defined on a standard of, daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, semi-annual, annual.
And, Amira and Kyle both, I think, touched on this, that the federal documents do give more granularity. I think the 800-53 document does provide some better guidelines on what's considered a reasonable period of time for those things.
Appreciate that.
And just a suggestion, because there are going to be, like Thad was saying, like weekly, monthly, bi-monthly, quarterly, right, semi-annually. There are all different schedule. So it's better for you to actually have an enterprise schedule, like a maintenance schedule, and say, yep, for this month, we're going to do this, and spread out to the next 12 months, like for the entire year, when you're going to do what, and that might be a better way to manage what you're going to do. And also, I will say, try to automate as much as possible, because doing everything manually, it's probably going to be very time consuming. So whatever you can do to automate, and just generate an alert when things go wrong, right? Don't go to look at everything if it's going right. And if everything, you have a script to actually go test and everything's going fine, yeah, you can just do an automatic check for those controls.
Thank you, Kyle. We have a question here that says, how do you write a procedure for security assessment items, like creating a security system security plan? Eric, do you want to take that one?
So basically, you can follow a method that's going to help you develop your system security plan. Just for example, if you're using NIST 171 and you perform your scoping, you define what's in scope, what's outside of scope, and then you work on your POAM, plan of action and milestones. As you develop your plan of action and milestones, you figure out, hey, what practices are implemented and what's not. You take that into your consideration when you're building out your system security plan. So that way you identify, those controls that are pertinent to your environment and that are in scope. And then you build on those, that system security plan to make sure that you are, safeguarding and implementing those controls and best practices based on what you're doing, what that CUI is, what that data you're protecting is in that environment.
Amir, do you have anything to contribute on that?
There is a requirement in CMMC right now to write step-by-step procedures for how you're going to do every practice. And, things like a step-by-step procedure for writing a system security plan, or, how to create a plan of action. Those are pretty tricky topics. The best I can think of is maybe reference to outside documents, perhaps from NIST, that say, here's how you do it.
Yeah, that's what I was going to follow up with. I would point everybody to NIST 818, I believe it is. It's how to develop a system security plan. So you're obviously going to have all your main POCs, your information owner, your information system owner, if you have an authorizing official, which for most organizations they're not, but their CISO, their CIO, who basically owns the information. Do you have system diagrams? Do you have data flow diagrams? And then, of course, how you document how you're complying with every single control is what makes up a system security plan. So I would say everybody, this is all built on NIST guidance. So why not use the NIST guidance as your framework?
Just to add, because in the CMMC, there's a list of assessment objectives for each of the practice. So just to make sure that you address when you're going through the system security plan, you also make sure to check off each one of the assessment objective, right? So, for example, AC 1.001, they actually have like 6 assessment objectives, right? Not just one practice, but you just when you're documenting your system security plan or that practice, what you're doing for that practice, make sure you include the answer to those assessment objectives.
We have a question, it ties right around what you're talking about, Kyle. It says, what information should be in the security assessment plan that the auditor will look at and also accept? Are there other pieces of data than what we just discussed?
Yeah, go ahead, Amira.
Sorry, this is one of my favorite topics. So the system security plan, there's going to be a couple sections, and you can download a template for it from the NIST SP 800-171 page. It's obviously not going to be a CMMC customized plan, but you can take it and reformat it. You should have network diagrams, data flow diagrams, maybe organizational charts, maybe physical facility layout diagrams that show your systems as well as your CUI scope. You should have an in-depth analysis and description of each of your network components and security systems and how they interrelate. And it should be written so that the assessor can read this and understand your environment, essentially, right? So it's an introduction to your environment. And then for each practice, you want to talk about whether, whether it's implemented, not implemented, or not applicable. You want to talk about why, right? If it's implemented, how are you implementing it? And you should, one of the things that a lot of people, I think, do wrong is they try and be vague in their system security plan. Maybe they're thinking they're going to release it to other companies, but be as specific as you can, because that system security plan will be the answers that you give to an assessor, so you don't have to come up with it out of your head, on the spot of the moment. It should say, here's the procedure that implements this practice. Maybe here's the records that show that I've been doing this procedure, right? This is where you can find them. And you should be talking about how each of your systems do the practice, including ones that you're inheriting. So if you're...
I would just say, Amir, for larger organizations, the security controls they use to monitor a lot of times are software tools, right? Or built into some of the products. But for smaller organizations, they're probably going to have to do a lot of manual because they won't be buying the type of network tools that will be monitoring the controls like in larger networks, correct?
That's tricky because you know, I haven't met a software tool that just does everything for you without some human review and oversight. You know, so it's a good time saver, of course, but it's you know, a lot of GRCs they say they'll make your system security plan for you. The level of detail that they put in is generally not enough to pass an assessment. You're going to need to supplement quite a bit.
Can I ask you a question, Amira? Just because I'm not registered to do the audits. In between, when do you suggest an organization review things as they add a new tool and processes for going around that? Just out of curiosity, because I'm sure a lot of companies are going to start their journey, because we're all on a special trip to CMMC, with one set of tools and start expanding as they go or contracting. What would you consider a best practice for updating?
So I'm a huge fan of the change management process for doing a lot of the requirements in CMMC. And as part of the change management process, which maybe has 20 steps,
Right.
you know, one of the steps should be, did you do a security impact analysis, and which practices are impacted by this change? You know, which practices do we need to apply to this new system, for example, or reapply if it's a migration? And then part of the planning should also be what documentation needs to change. And in a lot of cases, if you're making a significant change, your system security plan will be the answer to that, right? As well as maybe procedures, user training, other things. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Amira. And thank you, Karen, for those questions. Okay, any other last points around security assessment? We need to move on to the next domain.
Yeah, I think Karen touched upon the open source in the first question. So I will just say, if there is any internally developed software, have to go through this secure code review. Among the other security reviews, security assessment on the software or the code that you develop, right? So there are actually some free tools. OWASP is actually OWASP is actually a good resources if you don't already have some tools to conduct testing on your code or software that you develop. There are some static code review, or dynamic reviews that you can actually use, and that there are some free tools out there. Open source obviously is an important topic, because most of the software actually have at least one open source components in there. So even the new Biden executive order, and also the CMMC, they're going to be focusing on the open source components. So what we call software supply chain, right?
Software bill of materials.
Yeah, software bill of material as bound. So that is going to be important to make sure, if you're developing software, make sure you check and to make sure your software is secure when you release it.
Thank you for that, Kyle. Great points. All right, our last and final domain that we're covering today is audit and accountability. Really covers 4 areas: define audit requirements, perform auditing, identify and protect audit information, and review and manage audit logs. A lot going on there. I'll throw out the first question. Can you provide an explanation of the requirement, review, and update logged events?
I'll take that one. That's actually very simple. So you have your list of audits that you're reviewing, and then you find out there's new threats, there's new Maybe you add a component to your system, so you have to go through and update what audits you're collecting and analyzing. So it's just simply doing a review and to make sure that you're capturing everything that you need to be able to have visibility on your network and know what's going on.
Yeah,
Great.
and this, just
go ahead,
so
Kyle.
add, yeah, this one is actually, this section is actually a lot more clearly defined, a lot more clear defined by by the CMMC practices. So some of the CMMC level 3 assessment guide actually have a little bit more detail on what should be logged. There are some typical suspect, the log on, successful, failure to log on, all the activities that the person or the account's actually being performed, right? So be able to actually trace, just think about if there is a security incident, what kind of activities do I want to see during my investigation? And that should be all the activities that should be logged to provide you with the evidence so you can trace back and say, yeah, this is exactly what happened. When the bad guy comes, this is what happened. And then you have the evidence, be able to actually do the forensics.
Thank you, Kyle. Go ahead, Angela.
I would just add also that reviewing. So once you set that list of what should be audited or logged, it is not static, obviously, that there may be new threat intelligence or changes in your network or other inputs that cause you to reevaluate that and expand the scope of logging or audit more frequently and things like that. So it's not a once and done, but a constantly dynamic list of things to check, and then your response to each of those items.
Great. In the control AU 3.045 review and update logged events, what's the frequency required there?
Depends if you have the tool or not. If you actually have an automated tool, I think it's going to be ongoing. Yeah, because you actually just look at it when there's alert, and hopefully you don't have too many alerts that are really actionable. You probably want to define what is actionable alert, what is an actionable alerts versus just noise, right? You want to filter out the noise, and so that means if there is automated tools, hopefully you do, because it will be very impossible to actually look at the logs manually, because you are going to have the firewall logs, server logs, email, all the storage, and yeah, there are going to be quite a few application logs, right? So you really want to be able to use one of them. They're talking about the log correlation, the SIM, security information and event management tool. Be able to pull all the logs together, define some of the rules, and show you the alerts when some conditions are met, right? So those are going to be something that's more important, more manageable. So I would say it's probably going to be, if you have the automated tool, generate alerts, you probably want to look at it, daily. If it's not smaller companies, probably can look at it weekly. I will suggest still going to look at it daily, so you know exactly what's going on. If you don't have the tools, yeah, it's really going to be very difficult to even do it, because if you actually waited for like a weekly, there are going to be several gig, if it's not, hundreds of gig of data, it's not going to be possible to actually review it manually.
Brings up a point when you say automated. Is it required for every organization that is meeting level 3 CMMC to have a SIM or have a log management tool? Or, I mean, if your company, let's say you have 5 people and you provide some type of audit accounting services, but you're dealing with CUI and you hire, 1099 contractors to go into facilities and do some of that auditing. Do they have to invest in a SIM when they're so small, or can they do that manually?
Very hard to aggregate, correlate in a single central or in a central repository without some sort of log management tool, even if not a full SIM. But the central concept of central repository, I think, leads one to some basic SIM capability.
Yeah, there's also an audit requirement to be able to generate a report. So you have to use some type of tool to be able to generate that report to see what's going on in your network. And it's impossible to go through and look at manual logs. It's literally impossible to correlate different things that are going on in your network that all tie together to be able to see what's really going on. So you have to have some type of tool to be able to meet the CMMC requirements.
And just to add, yeah, if they do not have the capability, they can definitely find a capable managed service providers or managed security service providers to outsource to them, because they might have they will have the capability to actually analyze the log that you have and then give you the report and correlate these logs, generate events. That's what's going on.
Great, Kyle. Under AU 3.052, it says provide audit record reduction. What is meant by that?
That's kind of what we're talking about. So the idea of having a SIM is that you don't need to read the raw logs, because that, basically one computer would overload somebody with logs by themselves. So by putting logs through a system that can do correlation, reporting, and log reduction, AKA alerts, right? That's a way for you to efficiently get through 20,000 logs by just glancing at the screen and seeing if there's something flashing red.
Great, thanks, Amira. Identifying and protecting audit information. That's just going through that reduction summary report and then saving it, right? Backing it up, or what is really meant by that?
So for this control, what the point of this control is to make sure that someone can't go and cover their tracks. So you want a tool that forwards logs or pulls logs, and they can't be altered in any way. So you want to be able to keep that chain of record. So if you actually have a legal matter to go through, you can stand up in court and say, look, these logs are protected. There's no way they can be altered. So that's the whole point of this control, is making sure that no one's able to go back and cover their tracks. There's a way to be able to show that chain of record of what actually happened.
So probably within that scope, you would want to limit management access to that log management tool, correct?
Absolutely, and that goes to one of the controls. You're only supposed to allow access to audit logs to people that actually are reviewing audit logs, and not.
I was just going to say separation of duties, right? So whoever's managing your firewall is not, or your SQL server, it's not also managing your SIM server.
The Department of Defense, the government, considers audit logging to be a key separation of duty activity. The person who can modify or delete audit logs or stop audit logs from occurring should not be the same person that can do regular admin work, which can be difficult for small businesses.
Yeah, a lot of these controls, I think, are very difficult for small businesses, right? They don't have a lot of the same tools and structure that more mature organizations have. All right, we're at 11:46 right now. Any other points any of the panelists want to make around defining audit requirements, performing auditing, identifying and protect, review and manage audit logs?
There are a couple of points in the chat too about different places where you can go to find tools of varying sizes for different size businesses. Someone mentioned Splunk, which could be used for a larger company. Depends on volume, how expensive that gets. And Kyle mentioned this too, that managed service provider, many of those have managed SIM products that are not terribly expensive. They range in price and obviously capability, but there are many options out there to cover this control well.
there's two clarifications I'd like to make, because I personally, when I started looking at these controls, years ago, I didn't understand them, so I figure most people didn't either. But review and update logged events. If you just glance at it, you go, oh, well, that means review your audit logs. And no, that one actually specifically is about changing how your audit logs are created, so that events are logged or not logged based on your lessons learned from incidents, or based on improving your processes. I'll think of the next one in a second.
No worries. I'm going to start throwing up some additional questions. This we'll probably cover in one of the three domains, but not in specific order of the last one that we're doing. It says here, what should organizations know to report suspicious devices, vendor, et cetera, in the supply chain?
So I will start. So I think it's really depending if there's what kind of a problem, right? If this is something that is small, then they can deal with them directly, or if this is going to be becoming an incident, or say there is some kind of a problem that caused the CUI information to leak, that probably become a data breach or a security incident. That's when you have to report to DOD, right? And the report to DOD, there's requirements specifically defined in the DFAR 7012, 252.204/7012. That's saying like you have to report the incident if there's a security incident that impacting the contract, or if there's a data breach or something that you notice. Discovery of the incident, then you have to report within 72 hours of the discovery to DOD, and that's when you have to go to the DOD website. I think it's like givnet.dod.mil. That's where you actually have to report the incident. But I think it really depends on the type of incident or type of security events that you actually found. And if there is something that you can address with your suppliers, that means do that. But if you're something that's serious, then you have to report.
Thanks, Kyle. I have a question here that says, are organizations seeking CMMC certification expected to validate vendors' cybersecurity programs to the same extent as their own? I guess that would depend on what the vendor is doing, right? If we're an MSSP doing log management for you, there's definitely requirements, because we're being part of that chain of information and controls that's under the scope of that level 3 certification. What would you guys say in addition to contribute to that?
So the DFAR is very specific. It says there's Flowdown requirements if you're passing on CUI. So if you're a company and you have subcontractors and they're going to have to have access to CUI, then you got to flow down those requirements. So you've got to issue them a contract that says, here's all the requirements you need to meet. Outside of that, I would like to hear what the rest of the panel really has seen in action on how you can actually manage this. For companies that I've worked with, there's usually a lot of questionnaires that Prime is flowing down to their subcontractors. It says, it has a list of 10 questions, but every questionnaire I've seen is totally different and asking different questions. So I'm just curious how other consultants on this call is kind of managing the flow down requirements.
Yeah, so for what we have seen, definitely, what we have seen is that we're actually conducting the supplier meeting, right? So get all the in scope suppliers together, and we'll conduct a meeting on behalf of our customers to actually say, you're in scope. Give you a kind of like a brief understanding in terms of what are the requirements, and then give them the understanding what is CUI, what type of information that you have to protect, to some of the overview of what is the requirements, some of the default requirements, the upcoming CMMC, and that these are what you have to do. Then go back and here's the questionnaire, kind of like the process that you're seeing with a lot of large primes, but these are going to be for the smaller companies that have to do that as well. And I think, yeah, I think you can only go down one level, because that becomes the subcontractor, your subcontractor's responsibility to make sure they flow down. It's not going to be an easy process, and I don't know how DoD will be able to manage like nth level subcontractors, because it's really not that easy to actually manage. So if you come down to very small companies, they probably will have a hard time flow down already. And it will be a little bit difficult for them to manage their subcontractors and make sure they are compliant. Yeah, so I would say, yeah, this is something that we have done, but yes, I would say giving the questionnaire to the company's subcontractors are still probably the best way to do, and make sure they sign it, and say they're going to manage and flow down their subcontractors.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is, there is the 7019 requirement that's still an interim rule, but it's still a rule as is that they have to at least do a basic assessment, and they have to have a score entered into SPRS, meet those requirements before you flow down any information to them. So I would say at least meet the DoD requirements as of right now. But who knows? I mean, as soon as that defarce clauses, 7019 through 7021 are finalized, who knows what changes are going to come from that. So more to follow, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the 7020, so 7019, 7020 saying that they have to submit their assessment score, right, to attest that they have done their self-assessment or some of the basic or medium-high assessment, and submit their results to the SPRS system. But that record is not visible to anyone other than the submitter, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, but we can only take the word for it.
Yeah, two quick adds. That record itself is CUI. When you submit it, it does say that this the SPRS or SPRS score is CUI. But I wanted to throw this out too. One of the challenges that we've had, I'd love feedback from anyone else, finding supply chain vendors or equipment for internal servers or firewall or SIM servers and things like that where you can fully identify the supply chain a credibility or risk associated with that is very challenging. And then on top of that, the cost of the equipment is much more expensive. So I'm just I'm curious to know how everyone else has handled that and identifying a solid supply chain, and then managing the additional costs associated with that.
Yeah, so there is the DOD Approved Products list, and then you know for a fact that it meets FIPS requirements, some of the other NIST requirements to be able to get on the APL. But the APL is very, very small. It doesn't have, it's not a very broad list of products that are available. But if a product is on that list, then you're assured that it's met the requirements for basically to be a part of a DoD network. So I would say go to that list. That might be your starting point. But I wouldn't say that don't choose something that's not on the list just because it's not on the list.
In regard to vendors that handle your CUI or provide security for your CUI, MSPs, MSSPs, cloud providers, from an assessor standpoint, we would need proof that those vendors are doing the CMMC practices, at least the ones that are related to their system, if it provides security. And if it actually stores CUI, then those vendors would need proof showing that they're doing CMMC for pretty much every practice. And there's very few vendors out there that can provide that level of proof. It's almost limited to just the vendors that have gone FedRAMP authorized, because the controls in FedRAMP can be mapped to CMMC. Other audit reports like SOC 2 are just a fraction of what CMMC requires. It's a major concern in terms of how people will actually be able to prove that their systems and the vendors providing those systems meet CMMC.
So if the MSSP has or is about to receive their C3PAO certification, would that type of company fit the bill? Given that they have to go through their own CMMC level 3 assessment.
Maybe. So if their system that they're doing the MSSP work and the people that they're doing it with is the same that they went through their C3PAO certification, then probably. Actually the group I'm a vice chair for, the C3PAO stakeholder forum, we sent a letter to the DOD in April, and we basically said, please set up a standard system for providers to get audits of the things that they are inheritable for. So maybe not their own information system, but if they provide, say, MSSP services, have a system to perform a CMMC audit against those practices so that they can be inherited by their customers.
Thank you, Amira. Robert, thank you for the question. It is top of the hour. As time goes fast, I appreciate all of the panelists and their contributions and everybody that joined us today. You will receive an email after this with a link to the recording. So anybody that had to jump in and out of this for priorities and meetings as we go through our daily jobs, you will be able to go back and watch that. Also watch for another email for our part 4 in this series. We have 2 more to cover all 17 domains, and we also have those previous past 2 recordings available as well. So I appreciate everybody's time. Thank you for attending today. If you have any additional questions, any guidance that you need in this endeavor, please don't hesitate to reach out to us, and we'd be happy to point you in the right direction. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Robert, Dasha, Mike, Eric, Karen, Thad, Kyle, Angela, Amira, and Dasha. We appreciate it. Have a great day.
Thank you, David.
Bye-bye.